All right, everyone. I am so excited to have Lesha here with us tonight. Her talk is going to be on trauma prevention and resiliency for birth and postpartum. Lesha is an occupational therapist turned advanced craniosacral therapist, pre and perinatal somatic practitioner, postpartum doula, and womb guide. Going through her own healing process and working for over 15 years with trauma, pregnancy, and newborn, she began to see the major need for more comprehensive care for women on multiple levels. She's passionate for supporting both mothers and infants in preconception through postpartum care from a physical, emotional, and spiritual perspective. Her mission is to guide women and mothers to learn to listen to their own intuition and deep body wisdom, create safe spaces for somatic trauma resolution, and repair our earliest birth imprints. Lesha, we are so happy to have you here. I'm going to let you take it away. And Lesha's got to unmute. Perfect.
Thank you. And you guys, it's always so weird when people introduce me. I'm like, it just feels so weird. But when the Hive asked me to come speak, I was like, well, what would you like me to speak on? Because there's a lot of different things that I do. And I decided I didn't really want to stand up here, sit up here and just tell you about like craniosacral or somatic processing. I wanted to give you a couple of tools, whether you're in postpartum or you're preparing for birth. And the initial CG, I saw your name briefly, but I'm just curious if you are postpartum, if you're pregnant, if you're both, maybe you're in both worlds, just so I know who's here. If you're willing to unmute yourself and just let me know. Maybe she's not actually here.
I'll start. I'm 3 months postpartum.
Okay, amazing. And Amy, before we got on the call, she's due in July.
Yes, sorry, July 17th. So I'm coming up.
It won't let CG unmute, so she's working on it. Okay, when you know, just let me know. Leah, I know, is about 2 years postpartum. And then Eliza actually recently took a training that I have for doulas on trauma prevention and integration. So I'm happy to see you here, Eliza. Thanks for joining. You're going to get a review of a lot of what you know. So I'm going to share my screen. I will say we'll be on here for about an hour. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I want to leave plenty of time for practices. I really want to give you practical tools to use. So I'm going to use about the first 15 or 20 minutes to fly through some slides. And by fly, I mean, we're going to go through them pretty quickly. They are very much of the head. They're about the science of how trauma can get stored in the body. There might be some trigger warnings. I just want to let you know that we are talking about birth trauma. We are talking about the statistics. We are talking about trauma in general. So please be sure to take care of yourself as you need throughout this period. And then when we go through the practices, it really is an open space to ask any questions, to be here, ask questions how to apply it to your postpartum or to your upcoming pregnancies. Because I'm all about giving you guys the tools. So let me share.
Hi, sorry, I think I had to rejoin to come off mute, but I'm 3 months postpartum.
3 months postpartum. Okay, great. I love it. Thank you for rejoining and letting me know that. Okay. So we're going to talk about prevention and resiliency for birth and postpartum. A couple quick definitions. When I talk about soma or somatics, that refers to the body and the feelings within the body. This does not necessarily talk about the mind. It's what's going on down here. Whereas obviously the brain or neuro is what's happening up here. And then trauma is a really hard thing to define sometimes, but it's basically a distressing or disturbing event that causes overwhelm in the body. So when I look at trauma and I talk about trauma resolution, I'm talking about it from a somatic perspective and talking about it from the overwhelm within the body. So again, it's a deeply stressful or disturbing event. It can be physical, mental, or emotional, or a combination of the three. PTSD is where you are diagnosed officially with a psychiatric disorder. It's where you actually have changes within the brain. And it's usually when you're experiencing traumatic symptoms 6 months past the initial onset. PTSD is usually is typed into intrusive memories, avoiding certain situations, negative changes in thinking and mood, and then changes in physical and emotional reactions. So that's usually what they're looking for when they are diagnosing people with PTSD. So trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. And that's by Gabor Mate. If you're unfamiliar with his work, he's a great physician that I would say he started his research on addiction, and within the last 10 years, he's been talking a lot about how trauma is stored within the body and how to start to work with the body. And Jessica McGuire, who's a woman that out of Australia that I took a polyvagal course with, she's great. She's on Instagram if you want to find her. But when we start to understand the nervous system, we start to understand it's not us, it's the way our nervous system is wired. So trauma is more about what's happening on a nervous system level and understanding what's happening in a body level. So between 15 and 24% of women report their birth as traumatic, which is a really high statistic. This is in the United States. And newer studies report that trauma is as high as 60% in the United States. So that's more than half. 1 in 4 women will report PPD, which is postpartum depression after giving birth. And that's risen from 14 to 31% since 2020 when we had COVID. And post-traumatic stress disorder has risen from 4 to 30% since COVID. So what are the risk factors? Like when we talk about birth trauma and maybe potentially experiencing birth trauma, we know that a history of anxiety or depression prior to pregnancy can increase the risk of anxiety and depression and birth trauma, and anxiety and depression after. We also are learning that poor nutritional health can lead to things like preeclampsia, and this is nuanced here, right? Like what is good and bad nutritional health, and that's a whole other topic for another day. But we are seeing that as our soil gets depleted and we're having less minerals and we're having less healthy meats and iron deficiencies, we're seeing lots more preeclampsia, we're seeing lots more of need for inductions, we're having a lot higher needs for birth interventions, which then lead to traumatic births. We know that if we have access to supportive providers and a healthcare team, that we have better outcomes. There's amazing research happening right now with doulas, and they're actually working on many state levels to get doulas paid for by Medicare or by Medicaid, because research is showing that when you have a doula, it drastically decreases your chances of a birth trauma and postpartum depression and anxiety after. And then I think I said this already, but a history of previous trauma. So when we talk about, and this is the heady and the science, and I like to share about this because for me, I knew I needed to meditate, but until I understood why I needed to meditate, I wasn't motivated to. And so I feel like if people understand why and what's happening in the body, it's easier to do things like breath and the practices we're going to work with this afternoon or this evening. So we have the brain and the spinal cord, and we have the automatic and the somatic. So this is our body. This is our nervous system. Somatic are the voluntary and the skeletal muscles. So I'm like, move my arm, and my arm moves. I'm telling it to do that. But autonomic are things that happen without us thinking about it. This is our heart rate, our blood pressure, our respiration. I just ate dinner. I don't have to tell my body to digest. It's just happening. And then that breaks down into 2 more systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And hopefully you guys have heard these terms so far or already in this world. So parasympathetic, you want to think about this, or the PNS, is the rest and digest system. And this is the normal resting state of the body. This is not where most of us spend our time. But this is where we like to spend our time when we're doing things like meditation or on vacation or actually getting sleep, which doesn't happen a lot in postpartum. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight system. So that should say flee or we fawn, and it's activated to let you know you're in danger. And people think that this is a bad system. They're like, you never want to be in the sympathetic system, but this isn't a bad system. The sympathetic system turns on in the morning and is what wakes you up. So we actually need this system. What we don't need is to have it on all the time. And most of us are living with the sympathetic nervous system on most of the time. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our social engagement system briefly. I'll talk about it in future slides, but just think about it as in terms of relationship and what's happening, especially during times like breastfeeding or bottle feeding. So as I said, the parasympathetic nervous system is the normal resting state. This is where we like to be. This is our default mode. When we're in this place, we have a decreased heart rate, decreased respiratory rate, our salivation increases, our glucose is stored, and our digestion increases. I might come back to this slide in just a second. Just make sure, yeah. So the other system, when we're in the sympathetic nervous system, we're activated, and we're activating our adrenals. And this is where we get adrenal fatigue. Excuse me. So anytime we're stressed out, even just a little bit, we're affecting our heart rate. We're affecting our glucose stores. We're affecting our digestion. We're affecting our blood pressure, and we're affecting our respiration. So we're constantly putting our body into a state of stress. So people can act a couple different ways. I've already said we have flight, which is where you flee and you move away. You have fight, which is where you can get really aggressive. And again, sometimes this is good. Sometimes we need to be in fight mode and be like a big mama bear for certain reasons. So it's not saying like one is good or bad. It's that we don't want to be in this system all the time. This is where we get people-pleasing tendencies when we smile and we're like, oh, everything's fine, but everything's not fine. This is a hypersocialization effect or a fawning effect. And then the hypervigilance, you can kind of see it sometimes in people that walk really tense or have their arms close to their side or their jaw. It's just like this constant alertness or restlessness. And the other end of that spectrum is hypoarousal, and this is where we can go into freeze. And this is an immobility or a numbness. And this happens a lot in birth, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is where you're literally motionless before we go into a full freeze, because a full freeze is like you cannot move, you cannot do anything. You start to dip down into that, and so you might start to feel flat. You might start to feel collapsed. This is where shame comes in, avoidance, and we have a lot of chronic pain and fatigue and illness here. So when we have this excessive stress, we're in our fight, flight system, our flee system all the time. And so an example I like to use is you wake up and you read an email and it's a stressful email. It's like first thing in the morning, you haven't even done anything else. We're just automatically on our phones and we don't like the email, and it subtly activates our system. We get a little increased heart rate, increased agitation, and that sends signals to our brain, which then sends signals to our adrenals to release cortisol and stress hormones, and those wash through our body. And it takes some time for those hormones to wash through our body and move through our body and come back down to baseline. But what happens is oftentimes is after we read that email, suddenly our baby wakes up and it's screaming and we need to make a bottle. And our 2-year-old wakes up and is crying because they had a bad dream. And so we're getting another hit of adrenaline if that's a stressful experience for you. more hormones are rushing through our body, more cortisol, more adrenaline. And that's rushing through our body while the previous email hasn't even come back down to baseline. And then the next thing happens, and then the next thing happens. And so it's not to say again that this system is a bad system, but what happens is we're constantly bombarded again and again and again and again throughout our day. And over time, this decreases our resiliency. It changes our brain quite literally, and it means that we're activated for stress more and more and more. And I think about this a lot for our postpartum moms who aren't sleeping well. And I wish I could remember where I read this statistic, but it was like an average mom with a 3-year-old is 7 years delayed on sleep, like 7 years behind. And so we know that decreased sleep can change the brain and increase our stress levels. And so I just think that there's not enough conversation in our society around what's happening with the lack of sleep, the excessive stress that's happening to mothers or to birthing people in our society. And we don't support them enough. And then we're wondering, why are there mental health issues? Well, this is why. So just to think about it in this slide, you don't really have to go too into this slide, but the way our brain works, this top part of our brain is our mammalian brain. It was the last to develop. This is our wise mind. This is where we think, are creative, have connection with people, communicate well with people. And the next layer of our brain is our reptilian brain. And this is where basically like emotions, rewards. And then we go down into the brainstem. But basically what this picture shows is if there's trauma or if there's stress, we're in these lower parts of our brain. We're not in this part of our brain. And so we need to be in this part of our brain, not in our emotional brain, in order to think creatively, in order to work our jobs, in order to communicate well with people. And the more and more stress that we have in our system, this part of our brain actually grows larger, and this part of our brain shrinks. It's kind of a bummer. And so we spend more time being in an emotional state. The good news is that by doing activities and certain practices, and it doesn't take that long, this part of your brain actually shrinks and this part of your brain grows. And that's why people that have been meditating for a long time or that do certain practices and ways of being, something can happen, something emotional or a stressor, but because this part of their brain is larger, they're not as affected as much. It's not as much as a stressor to them. So keeping in mind that neurons that fire together wire together. So if you have a learned response to act a certain way every time you are activated, you will keep acting that way without thinking about it every single time. So this is a genius way for our bodies because it means that we can learn to ski and we can learn to ride bikes and we can do things and we can get better at them and we can excel. It's also great for children because we're showing that children that are learning while playing learn the activity quicker and better because two things are happening. Neurons are firing together and wiring together, and so they're learning quicker. What this means for us is that I love an example. There's a really great book called What Happened to You by Dr. Perry and Oprah Winfrey. Really great book if you're into these things and understanding this better. He uses an example of someone who had a gym teacher growing up that was not nice and would constantly yell at her. This is actually a true example. And then later, growing up, she had to go to work and she's in the work field and she is having a PTSD response to her boss because just the way her boss talks reminds her of her gym teacher, but it was subconscious until they sat down and figured out and talked that out and figured out like, oh, his mannerisms and his voice reminds me of this traumatic experience. And so this can be happening all the time. The way I learn something or the way my body is wired, a trauma happens, my body wants to remember that trauma to keep me safe. And then maybe a certain smell or a certain person or a mannerism will subconsciously attune my nervous system and go, that's not safe. But maybe that situation is actually just fine. It's just that it's triggering a memory from a previous event that isn't safe. And this can happen a lot in birth, where previous neural pathways that are wired and previous ways of being within our sensory system get activated within the birth environment. And then we're triggered, but we don't know why we're triggered. And our body's having usually a parasympathetic response, and we're not sure why. I'm just going to quickly, does anyone have any questions so far? You can unmute yourself if you do. Just feel free. Just make sure it's all good so far. Okay. We're almost done with this part and we'll get to the practices. So I'm really passionate about teaching about the window of tolerance, because I really feel like once we understand the window of tolerance and once we can start to track our own nervous systems, this is where we start to create change. So our window of tolerance is basically what we have capacity to be present to. So there's a slow pace, a medium pace, and a fast pace. And as babies, when the people around us model a certain slow, medium, or fast pace, that is what our nervous system picks up on, and that becomes our window of tolerance. So the fascinating thing is the window of tolerance is not set in stone. We can change and we can grow our window of tolerance to have more capacity. Basically, that just means our nervous system is going to have more capacity. It means that when we wake up and read that email and our baby's crying, if our window of tolerance is a large window of tolerance, we're actually able to be okay in that space and not have an activated system. So this is modeled by our caregivers. And I'm just trying to think if I have a personal example from when I was little, because my mom had a very slow pace. My mom had a lot of postpartum depression, was very withdrawn and very avoidant. And it's funny that I kind of turned out to be the opposite. I'm more of a fast-paced person. But there were a lot of times in my childhood and some different areas I've had to work through my own trauma, where growing up in a household where children are seen and not heard, certain parts of like just making sure that we were quiet all the time, like we weren't allowed to be super noisy. And so that just kind of imprinted within my nervous system, like it's not safe to be seen, it's not safe to speak up, it's not safe to have big movements, it's not safe to make a lot of noise. And so just to show, working a lot with my own nervous system, you wouldn't think that about me, because now I'm like loud and I'm on Instagram and I'm constantly talking all the time. But that's the process I've had to work through to change this window of tolerance. So just to show that it can change. So this is kind of what it looks like, just to give a visual, where this is the window. We have a functional fast, and so this would be play. And this is why play is so great for children, is because play actually increases your window of tolerance. It shows our bodies that being at this kind of like borderline fast pace is actually a really safe and fun place. Functional slow is where we're in meditation and we haven't fallen asleep yet, but we have slowed down the system. This is another great place to increase our window of tolerance because it's right on that edge. And we're showing our body that even though we're sitting and holding still and observing our thoughts, that we're also safe. So when we're right on these edges in a safe, controlled way, this is what expands our window of tolerance. And so preparing for birth, for those of you that are pregnant, play and meditation are really beautiful places to spend a lot of your time. And right on those edges of just like, where is your tolerance, where you're not shutting down into like so flat, and getting into those more like collapse disassociation states. And you're not jumping up into this flight, or hyper socialization startle place. So this is when we're hyper, this is when we're hypo, this is where we want to hang out. This is a normal day. The goal, if there's ever a goal, isn't to be like, oh, I'm perfectly calm and smooth and boring and in my window of tolerance all of the time. Like, honestly, that would be really boring. What we want is that if we come into this hyper state, that we're able to come back down. We're able to recognize that we're in a hyper state and come back down. And if we go into a hypo state, same thing, no problem. We just recognize it and we're able to come back up. This is how most of us live. I love this slide. This comes from Rachel Maddox. She has a great book called Rebloom. And this is from her, but we wake up and there's just like crazy town, panic attack, emails, getting kids out the door, trying to get ready for work, trying to do all the things. We're spending time in a spin. Our bodies cannot stay there. And so we crash into hypo. We have to come out of it. There's another big hit of adrenaline. There's another crash. And honestly, this is how I think about birth. There's a contraction, there's an intense moment. Things could be a little chaotic. Our bodies can't stay there. And so then we drop into this hypo in between contractions. So in birth, and if some of you are questioning about your own birth, if you've already had babies, what we want to start thinking about and training the body is recognizing that when we do come into these hyper states, that it's okay, it's normal, and that we're not going to stay there. We're going to come out of it. And hopefully by recognizing that, there won't necessarily be such a big crash. Instead, you'll come back into the window of tolerance. You'll have another contraction. And over time, you start to be more like this in birth instead of this. So the last system we're going to talk about before we do some practices is the polyvagal system, or basically our social system. And this is a system, this means that relationships matter. Let's just say it like that. But it means that for those of us that experience a lot of hyper or hypo, there's a third way to regulate our nervous system, and that is through our attachments and through orienting to safety. And it's basically everything that has to do with the face. It's eye contact, it's smiles, it's the jaw unrelaxed, it's the shoulders away from the ears, it's using your voice, it's your heart, it's receiving, it's empathy. This is the social engagement system. So the vagus nerve, if you guys have ever heard of the vagus nerve, this is part of the social engagement system. It's a huge nerve that goes all the way through our body. It starts in our brainstem, but it goes to our heart, our lungs, our kidneys, our cervix, our ovaries, our guts. It goes everywhere. So when people say, oh, I just had a gut instinct, that's your vagus nerve, actually. Information is coming to your guts. You're like, oh, that's not good. And it immediately sends it up to the brain. So we want our vagus tone to be high. Seems kind of backwards, but we like vagal tone. When we have vagal tone, we're more relaxed, we're more engaged, we're happier, we have better digestion. If we have decreased vagal tone, this is where we have a lot of anxiety and fear and overwhelm. Irritable bowel because it's controlling the bowels, constipation, insomnia, fatigue, chronic inflammation. And so much of this information that's coming in from our body, it's actually 80 to 90%, which is huge. Of the information comes in from our body and goes up to our brain. So that's why the body is so important is because all of these things are happening within our body and play a huge role in how we feel, and then sends the information to the brain all on a subconscious level. So when we're in this like calm, this is that rest and digest state that we talked about. It's ventral, so it's coming from the front. We can handle stress. We like to interact with others. We can follow tones and facial cues well. I just think about children so much here and children developing. When we're in our sympathetic, I can't quite read that word, but it's basically our ventral sympathetic and our sympathetic system. That's that same fight or flight system. And then when we're in our dorsal sympathetic, that's when we go into a complete freeze where we can't move. So what do we need to do? We need to basically bring awareness. That is the first change to all of this. And I'm recognizing I don't want to spend much more time because of time, and we did start a little late. But what we can do, just quickly want to share resiliency research. People that are more resilient and how we grow our resiliency is through supportive adult-child relationships. By having, there's these 4 things. This is what comes up in resiliency research. We have a sense of self-efficacy and control. We have adaptive skills and self-regulatory capabilities. And we have sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. But this is the one that's super important to me. We have regulatory capacities, and we're able to do that ourselves. And we do that through awareness and starting to understand, what the hell is my nervous system doing? What state am I in? What's actually happening right now? So those are some of the tools that I would like to give you. I'll just see quickly what's here. This is the last slide. Is how do we create change? We have to understand and start to track our nervous system, because if we don't know if we're flat, if we don't know if we're hypo, or if we don't know where we are within our window of tolerance, we can't create change. So we do that through interoception practices, which are basically practices that just bring you back to your body and help you feel your body. Small changes every day. Research shows 5 minutes diaphragmatic breathing, you have a brain change in 66 days, which is wild to me. Think about what gives you control, because that's going to help with the efficacy and the resiliency. Supportive people during and after pregnancy, tapping into faith, hope, and any cultural practices, body work, and any prolonged care like postpartum care. And then a postpartum plan is really important and not shared enough, not talked about enough. So this is how we start to create change. So any questions so far with anyone? And again, just unmute yourself. All makes sense. When there's no questions, I'm like, I either killed it explaining it or I didn't kill it, and people have no idea what I'm talking about.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, Christina.
Out
Please.
of that list, like, what do you think is out of those like multi-factors, one is more important? I know you said that, you can influence one, but is one more important than the other, or numerous ones more important than others?
I think it kind of depends on, like, where are you, being that you are more postpartum, like putting the supports in place that you possibly can at this point. I just want to speak that takes time, resources, money in our society, unfortunately. So putting in the appropriate prolonged supports, and then starting to work with your interoception. So starting to work with, like, what is my nervous system doing? And if my nervous system is really high and I recognize it, I'm going to start to bring it back down. If I'm very flat, I'm going to do the practices to bring it up. That makes sense?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I just said, yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I want to take you guys through a quick practice, and you can write this down if you want. I didn't ask anyone to bring paper and pen. So Feel free to write it down. I'd say if you don't write it down now, do it in the future because it can give you a really good insight to what is happening. Sorry, I just looked over and there's a cat in my yard and we don't own a cat, so I got slightly distracted. So if you want to just kind of do this in your head, that's fine. If you want to grab paper and pen, grab paper and pen. And if Josh is still here, he can do it too, Amy. Because dads are important too in this process. Okay. So let's just take a minute. I've been at a very fast pace talking about window of tolerance. I've been teaching and speaking, and so I'm at a fast pace. So an example to bring myself down, and you guys might already be down because you're listening, but I'm just going to bring my back to the chair and make sure my feet are flat on the ground and take a few breaths. You guys are welcome to do this with me. And just notice yourself breathing. And as I start to breathe, I'm going to just start to bring awareness to like what is happening inside my body. I just want to take a little pulse. What do I notice? What's happening? And I'm noticing like my jaw's a little bit shaky from speaking. And my belly is a little full because I'm still digesting dinner. So those are the two things that stand out. So I'm not judging them. I'm just like, okay, that's what's happening inside my body. And if you're not able to feel your body, totally fine. Just take a minute and notice instead, like, what are you sitting on? Does it feel soft or firm? Do you have more weight into your left side or your right side? Maybe notice the clothing on your skin. How do your clothes feel? And take a moment and you can look around your room or you can look around my computer screen around my room. And just take a moment and look around and just notice what you like. Just see where your eyes want to fall. Take that in. Notice the color. Is it alive? Does it have a memory tied to it? Now coming back to your body, just again, notice if anything has shifted. Might not. See where your attention is drawn. Take it in, and your eyes can be open or closed. Either one is fine. Just take a moment and maybe think about something slightly stressful that happened today. On a scale of 0 to 10, please don't pick a 10, pick like a 5 or a 6, like just something that got you into that fight or flight system. Just recall what happened, what you were doing. Maybe you were with someone, maybe you were alone. Just take a moment to notice what that feels like. It helps to have an example. I was doing my finances today. I'm not a financial person. That was a little stressful. I noticed at the time I felt very bummed, very like not happy. It's definitely in my sympathetic state. So I'm just recalling that memory. And just notice the sensations in your body as you start to think of that thing. Like my brain was kind of buzzing, my jaw was clenched. So we're just looking for some patterns here to let you know that this is when you're in your sympathetic state. Do you have an urge to do something? Like, do you want to run? Do you want to throw something? Do you want to scream? I wanted to scream and hire an accountant. That's a signal that I'm in my sympathetic state, is that I really wanted to scream, which is like a movement. And then try and recall what you were thinking or what you were saying or what you wanted to say. Because that's, again, a really good signal of like, this is my pattern. This is what I want to do and say. So just taking away like, oh, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to start paying attention to this. But now we're in our sympathetic states. Just by thinking about something, we can go into our sympathetic state. You might have jumped on the call in your sympathetic state. So to move out of sympathetic state, what we want to do, so for me, I said I was clenching the jaw. What we want to do is actually bring some release to this part of our body. So maybe the shoulders are up towards the ears. And again, it's going to be different for everyone, but again, just like maybe a little jaw massage. Maybe shoulders away from the ears. Maybe some co-regulation, like talking to your partner. This is a good time to do something like that so that there's some eye contact. But when we're in that sympathetic state, we want to think about relaxing that face. And we want to think about relaxing the belly. So if it helps, one chest, one hand on the chest, one hand on the belly. And diaphragmatic breathing, I hope most people know what that is, but instead of a chest breath, it's a belly breath. So when I breathe, I'll exaggerate. I'm moving my belly. As the inhale, the belly rises. Exhale, the belly drops. And I would say in real life, I don't always have time to do a round of diaphragmatic breathing, but I do have time to bring my shoulders away from the ears, relax my jaw, maybe my eyes, and take one breath. So if any of you practice that, let me know if there's any questions. That's your sympathetic state. And we're just really looking for those patterns. And as we started to come back down, let's go down into our dorsal vagal state. So this is when we feel flat or shamed or disconnected, disassociated. This might be the go-to for some people. So again, just take a moment and think about a time, might be from today, it might be from yesterday, but a recent time. Please don't choose a 10 because we're on a phone call and I'm not physically with you. Think of a time when you felt disconnected, a little flat, a little avoidant, didn't want to get out of bed. And again, just recall that memory. And start to notice, just as you think about that scenario, that you might already, like, your body's already kind of going there. And start to notice those sensations. So what's happening in your body as you recall this memory? Noticing like I'm not sitting in the back of my chair anymore. I came forward and I'm like rounding my shoulders and I like totally sunk down. Just talking about the dorsal vagal. Just notice if you have an urge to do anything here. The urge might be to do nothing. And then really paying attention to what do you think and say here. So some examples that are really common here is like, I don't want to, I can't, nothing's going to get better. Starting to recognize those common sayings. It's your sign that you're in this dorsal vagal state. So let's move out of dorsal vagal and come back up. So moving out of dorsal vagal, there's a couple things, but my favorite one is actually just a fixed posture. Like just pause, notice your belly, notice your posture. Are your sit bones, are your hip bones, shoulders over hip bones? Are you in a good pelvic alignment? So you're not, it's hard to see in this shirt, but your pelvis isn't too far forward and it's not too far back, but it's in this nice aligned state. That one we can do very quickly. The other one is we start to do some squeezes and squeeze the body. And I'm squeezing pretty hard here, and it just depends on how flat or how activated you are or how hard you're going to squeeze. If you're on a Zoom call, my favorite, you're doing this to your legs. No one knows. You're squeezing your legs, giving some activation. You can push your legs down into the floor with some pretty big pressure. That's going to also fix your pelvis, help you sit more upright. And then my other favorite one, if you have time and you're available, is actually some tapping. So you make a fist, not a hard fist, but you just move through and tap your body. And again, how hard is up to you of like what feels good. And you just kind of have to play with this. And you can go faster. And honestly, like during birth, during labor, this is a great one to do to your legs when you're starting to notice like, oh, I'm getting flat, I'm getting heavy. Those thoughts are coming in that I can't do this. And start tapping. So there's that one, gets us out of dorsal vagal. And then the very last one, and I'll open it up to questions because I'm supposed to end right at 8. Is that last place, that ventral vagal. So, of course, I want to end with this one. Thinking of a time when you were with someone, and maybe that someone is an animal, and you're with one of your favorite people. You're with that person that just like gets you. And just think of a time you were with them and you're doing something fun, or maybe you're just talking and having a coffee or a conversation. Just recall what that feels like to be completely understood and seen, comfortable, relaxed with this person. And as you recall this memory, just like the other questions, what sensations do you notice in your body? And just to give some examples, like my whole face is just really relaxed as I think about this memory. My hands are soft in my lap. I'm just really more aware of my body sensations here. And do you have an urge to do anything? And what do you think? What are your thoughts here? What do you say, or what do you want to say here? This is your body's way of letting you know you're in ventral vagal. You might even take a moment and just see, like, how does this feel different to the other two? To the more activated or to the more flat? Just noticing the differences between the three. And there really is like nothing to quote unquote do here, because this hopefully is the state that like we feel calm, we feel more relaxed. This is our ventral vagal, where we're with people or in that social communication space. And our nervous system is not hyperactivated and it's not hypoactivated. We're within that window of tolerance. So just a quick takeaway is just starting to track. The more that we can track, like, where am I in my window of tolerance? Where am I in my nervous system? And it's not that we're never going to be activated. It's not that we're never going to be hyper or hypo. It's that when we are hyper or hypo, that we bring awareness to it and do what we need to do to come back into that place of nervous system regulation. And it might seem impossible. Over time, it does create change. And doing things like meditation, diaphragmatic breathing as preventative are great things to do in between when you have time to prepare yourself or to keep yourself in that nervous system state. So that was a ton of information. I hope it started to give you like some recognition of these are my patterns. This is how I feel. These are my thoughts. This is my sensations when I'm in these different states. And so now I know when I'm in these states, and I have a couple quick little tools to start to practice with to bring myself back into this place. So I know it's 8 o'clock. I am happy to answer any questions or talk about anything postpartum birth, somatic related. If you want to hop off, that's fine too. But I am here as a resource and love nerding out on these things. So feel free to let me know.